to call this hearing to order. The hearing before the Senate Finance Subcommittee on International Trade, Customs, and Global Competitiveness. I want to especially thank my friend, our colleague, Senator Cornyn, and his team for the work that they've done with majority staff to help us prepare for and plan for this hearing. I thank everyone who's here in attendance. I know you have a lot going on, but we're delighted that you're able to work this in. We look forward to a number of things. Actually, we look forward to hearing the expertise that our witnesses have to offer, and we very much want to thank you for your service to our country, but also for joining us here today to testify. I want to thank our chairman, Ron Wyden. I want to thank Mike Crapo, our ranking member, and the Finance Committee staff for your policy expertise and for allowing us to board in this beautiful committee hearing room for the next couple of hours. Today's hearing provides us with an important opportunity to examine U.S. Customs and Border Protection policies and procedures for goods entering the United States. And this hearing also provides us with a forum to discuss the ways in which the policies laid out by Congress can work to improve port operations while enhancing our supply chains. Trade, as we all know, is an essential part of our economy. I'm told that last year in 2023, the United States, get this, the United States exported over $3 trillion in goods and services, $3 trillion last year around the globe, while importing nearly $4 trillion worth of goods in the same year. And thanks to this exchange of products and services that come through the more than 300 points of entry across the U.S. land, air, and sea, our daily lives are enhanced by access to goods from not just across the border in other states, but all around the world. Effective trade facilitation is a little bit like a puzzle. Strong port operations and resilient supply chains must fit together seamlessly to bring goods to the United States. And when it comes to port operations, most Americans may not realize that there are literally thousands of employees who work every day to ensure that our ports are safe and that they're secure. It takes considerable coordination by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection inspectors, as well as specialized workers and longshoremen, like one of our witnesses here today, in order to hold our international trading partners accountable to the rules of the road. For example, when the goods come through the port of Wilmington, not far from my home, it is the folks who I just mentioned who are doing the due diligence to make sure that a shipping container does not contain counterfeit products. Some of these rules of the road are set by the Congress through laws like the Bipartisan Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act and by the bipartisan Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, both of which are designed to ensure that our trading partners are paying their fair share of duties on the goods that are coming into the United States. And it's our port workers, like those at the Port of Houston, some of your folks, that thoroughly inspect the goods that arrive in the U.S. for illegal contraband, like fentanyl, or clothing made with forced labor, before approving them to move on to their next destination. Ultimately, all of these responsibilities shared by port employees work hand in hand to enhance our economy and our national security. We also have to ensure that the other piece of the puzzle, and that would be our supply chains, are sufficiently strong to face the pressures that life throws at us. For example, during COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain resiliency was tested maybe like never before. The pandemic exposed many unprecedented challenges like bottlenecks and like delays for medical products that still affect us even to today. And with the tragic collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge nearly 2 months ago, as our colleague Ben Cardin knows, our supply chains had to quickly adapt to a single but vital port of entry not operating at all. Thankfully, we were able to divert key imports like automobiles, like sugar, farm equipment from Baltimore to nearby seaports. But the accident that put a magnifying glass on the questions about preparedness of our nation's ports, and by extension, our nation's supply chains for emergency situations like this one. As my colleagues, I'll say this for our witnesses, my colleagues know I like to quote Albert Einstein. Einstein said any number of things that are memorable, but the one that I use probably every day is in adversity lies opportunity. I think he really nailed it. In adversity lies opportunities. That was true when he said it first. It's true here today. Despite recent adversity today, we have an opportunity to learn from our witnesses' first-hand accounts of what's working and what's not working when it comes to implementing trade laws like the ones I've mentioned just a minute ago in port operations. We also have an opportunity in today's hearing to better understand how we can and should invest in the long-term resiliency and security of our supply chains. In doing so, we can prevent future product shortages, shore up the ability to access life-saving products, and reduce the impact of unpredictable situations on American families. There's an old African proverb that goes something like this: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And throughout this hearing, I urge our colleagues in this committee to join Senator Cornyn and me and our staffs in thinking about how we can go further and faster together. It's a shared responsibility of Congress, of port workers, the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, and global trade governing bodies to work together to protect the people that we serve while implementing the safety and security of global trade. So once more, I want to thank our colleagues, especially want to thank our ranking member and the members of our staffs who've been working and preparing for this hearing for not just days or weeks, but actually months, as it turns out. And we appreciate the witnesses appearing before us. And with that, I want to turn it over to our ranking member, Senator Cornyn, for any comments he would like to make. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know how enthusiastic you are about today's hearing and the subject matter we're going to discuss, because you called me on Saturday to encourage more of our members to attend the hearing. But as usually happens here in the Senate, most of our members have multiple overlapping commitments. So, but that doesn't detract at all from the importance of this and the bipartisan support that this topic enjoys. We know that trade is critical to promoting our economic security, and it's important to improving the lives. 30 acres of our ports. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has the thankless job of facilitating legitimate trade and travel while enforcing our trade and immigration laws. In recent years, the surge in illegal immigration along the southern border has led to the temporary shutdown of passenger and rail crossings because they've simply been overwhelmed. Such delays caused by the ongoing border crisis have resulted costly to both businesses and consumers. In addition to hindering legitimate trade and travel, these challenges also make it hard to keep unlawful imports, such as products made with forced labor, counterfeits, drugs like fentanyl, from entering the United States. That's why I introduced the Catch Fentanyl Act, which requires CBP to analyze and test new technologies at land ports of entry to determine which ones are the most effective, efficient, and affordable. But this is obviously only one piece of a broader challenge that is needed and changes that are needed to keep up with the changing global trade environment. Our ports of entry are understaffed, yet the workload continues to grow. We owe a great deal to the men and women who serve in our ports of entry day in and day out. Last year, CBP processed more than $5 trillion in combined imports and exports and nearly 37 million imported cargo containers at U.S. ports of entry. While this continued growth is an overall positive for our economy, we have simply not staffed and equipped to deal with the volume. Evolving supply chains, which you mentioned, new players entering the marketplace, and the growing volume of commerce across our borders all present unique challenges for CBP and its industry partners. I'm eager to hear from today's witnesses about the best ways they recommend for us to meet those challenges. We also need to find new ways to increase efficiencies at our ports of entry. Trusted trader programs, for example, are one way to accomplish this goal, as they allow CBP officers to focus on higher risk goods and travelers. We should work to enhance and expand these programs where it makes sense. And I introduced legislation with Chairman Carper to do just that. The CTPAT Pilot Program Act of 2023 requires DHS to create a pilot program to assess the value of allowing third-party logistics providers to participate in the program. There are many other opportunities to strengthen U.S. trade by implementing much-needed changes at America's ports, and I look forward to today's hearing, particularly from these witnesses, to figure out how we might ease the burden on legitimate trade and travel while increasing compliance and enforcing our trade laws. Thank you very much.
Senator Cornyn, thank you so much, and thanks to you again and your staff for helping us prepare for this, and then several thanks to other members of the committee who are here, and those who aren't. We are just, we're in the middle of a vote on the Senate floor. I'm sure we'll be joined by others as they meet their responsibilities, and looking forward to their participation. I'm going to introduce our first witness, Mr. John Pickle. John Pickle is the Senior Director of International Supply Chain Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council. In his role, Mr. Pickle promotes efficient and resilient supply chains by advancing policies to prevent illicit trade, while implementing customs best practices and upholding human and labor rights. Previously, Mr. Pickle served as the Principal Director of the Trade and Economic Competitiveness in the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to that, he served in several different roles in the U.S. Customs and Border Protection for, I believe, over a decade. Is that right? Over a decade. All right. Mr. Pickle, welcome. And the floor is yours. Thanks. Please proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss trade enforcement and entry of merchandise at U.S. ports. As you all know, the importation and export of cargo at 327 air, land, and maritime ports nationwide enables our national and economic security by underpinning American jobs, ensures adequate supply of inputs for domestic manufacturers, and increases the purchasing power of U.S. consumers. While all ports are different, each relies on various government and private entities performing their role to continue the flow of supply chains. Importantly, U.S. Customs and Border Protection is the primary federal agency charged with enforcing U.S. trade laws and facilitating the flow of legitimate cargo. Last fiscal year, CBP processed over $5 trillion in imports and exports to collect revenue, and with 47 other agencies that regulate imports, enforced over 500 U.S. laws. Before ships, planes, and trucks arrive at ports, CBP receives information from various parties in the supply chain to evaluate risk. Most importers and shipments comply with U.S. laws, resulting in about 80% of inbound shipments being released before they physically arrive. In cases where incomplete or false information is received, CBP would benefit from the adoption of technology like artificial intelligence that can objectively validate data that drives risk assessment. Data-informed CBP processes and should be collected from the right party at the right time in the entry process. Data requirements should be developed in partnership with industry to address well-defined needs without slowing supply chains or increasing transaction costs. Modernizing CBP authorities, processes, and systems in a comprehensive way should balance enforcement capabilities and facilitation principles to enable resilient supply chains. Recent supply chain challenges have shown that ports, are where we focus attention during system failures. Improved efficiencies can be found in embracing trade facilitation principles. A third-way report found that improving trade facilitation would save the U.S. economy $88 billion in export costs and create about 1 million jobs across every state in the country. My written statement goes into more detail, but here are a few facilitation opportunities. Trusted trader programs are mutually beneficial to government and industry, but the cost of partnership is high for participants. Partnership benefits should be evaluated on an ongoing basis in consultation with businesses. Further, CBP should consider innovative ways to create new trusted trader programs that reflect current supply chain and business practices. Duty-free treatment of low-value shipments, or de minimis, facilitates supply chains while still subjecting shipments to enforcement of U.S. laws. All de minimis shipments are required to have the data that CBP uses for enforcement, and 80% of de minimis shipments include even more data through ongoing pilot programs. Congress stated the economic benefits of de minimis when raising the threshold in 2016. In fact, American exports benefit from de minimis policies in 89 countries, where they would otherwise face significantly higher tariffs than products coming to the U.S. Those standards could roll back if the U.S. signals lack of commitment in this area. Restricting de minimis domestically would bog CBP down in collecting minimal revenue at a loss rather than targeting, detaining, inspecting, and seizing actual non-compliant shipments. Entry requirements across the U.S. government should be entirely digital and not require duplicative filing or data. Current systems for data intake and sharing need to be updated to maximize digital payments and adopt downtime procedures that do not revert to paper entry forms. Agility in this area requires a governance structure that creates clear decision-making authority to resolve inconsistencies and duplication across agencies, dedicated resourcing, and an ongoing mandate to continually smooth the path of imports and exports. Responsible members of industry remain committed to working with CBP and other government agencies to create clear compliance standards, address supply chain vulnerabilities, and address risks, like forced labor and intellectual property theft at the source. Mitigating the root causes of these risks rather than solely through border enforcement is more effective in preventing violations from actually occurring and remove stress from the port environment. Supply chains are long, frequently complicated, and subject to external stress. The NFTC and our members look forward to working with this committee and others to reinvigorate public-private partnership that can result in meaningful systems updates that reduce pressure on the flow of goods through our ports. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Pickle, thank you very much for opening statement, for getting it started. And our second witness is James H. Paylor, Jr., Assistant General Organizer of the International Longshoremen's Association. The International Longshoremen's Association is the labor union that represents longshore workers on the East Coast of the United States. Now, over the last 5 decades, Mr. Paylor, a second-generation longshoreman, is that right? Second generation? Third generation, has established an impressive career. For much of this time, he has assumed leadership positions within his union, shaping its direction and championing the rights of its members. Mr. Paylor, welcome. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Kuhn, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear to discuss trade and commerce of our nation's ports. That ends my prepared statement. I was a longshoreman starting in 1973, and as you pointed out, I followed my father, who followed his father onto the waterfront. In 1973, I worked in the hull of a vessel, loading and unloading. The longshore industry consists of 3 classifications: all longshoremen, which are the loading and unloading of vessels and barges, the facilitating of receiving and delivery of cargo, which we refer to as clerks and checkers, and then the maintenance division of the International Longshoremen's Association, which does a multitude of job functions while on the terminal. When I became a ship's carpenter, I was assigned a responsibility of working directly with Customs back in 1973 and into 1974. That job at that time actually was working side by side with the Customs inspector, who would identify the cargo and we would travel with the inspector in different locations of the terminal, and then open the cases or packaging for any from apples to zebras is what I always say. They've all been on the waterfront. They would do what was said earlier in your opening statements, where they would check the origin of the cargo and make sure that the U.S. trade laws were in compliance with that cargo, and they would also be checking for actually insects and in a lot of cases drugs. When we found situations that were suspicious, many times we would leave the custom inspectors to perform the rest of their inspection, and then when they were complete, we would come back into the location and resecure all the packaging onto the cargoes that were being inspected. We would then turn in a billing process that included the bill of lading for the cargo, the type of cargo, and the type of inspection that we would provide, and then the stevedore or terminal operator would bill the shipper for that cargo. That changed, okay? Once containerization came into play, it changed the whole inspection process, where each location or terminal had to designate a portion of the port facility to accommodate the movement of the containers that would be brought to a docking facility, where the custom inspector then would identify the container and instruct us to open the container, which was cutting a safety security seal, and then open the container, and then the custom inspector would also determine how much of inspection had to be done out of that existing container. That went on for days at a time, and is still part of the process today. Once we unpackage the product, they do the investigation, and then we would repackage it and put it back into the same container and add a new security seal to it that was recorded for delivery. The other part of the inspections that were done at the terminal back then were actually inspection on imported meat, where thousands of loose boxes would come in to the port. There would be meat inspection rooms with the MID division or meat inspection division of the USDA, and we would open the meat boxes, actually cut 2-inch slabs out of the frozen meat and put them into a thawing tank, which would then be deposited onto a tray for inspection. That was a pretty normal process, okay? Then another event came, September 11th, and everything changed again. And what we realized in September 11th, that, as stated earlier, Customs did not have enough inspectors to staff all the different locations, especially with the higher level of scrutiny that was being performed at each terminal. They came up with the term of centralizing a centralized examination station instead of manning all the port facilities. Had the facilities send the containers to the central examination station. The impact was we lost many jobs as a result of that, and the people who were replacing our jobs at the remote area were working for a lot less than the family-sustaining wages that we got. That was the economics. The most important piece was we were taking the containers off the terminal and driving those containers through our neighborhoods, up onto our highways, sometimes through our sporting event facilities, crossing rivers and bridges to go to this remote area. So the higher level of risk was transferred from the port out into our communities. We were concerned about it. We're still concerned about that being an issue. We have a very good relationship with customs inspectors, and we expect to continue with that. And we look forward to enforcing whatever the policy rules that have been enforced, which we're not part of. But my recommendation would be that when there is a policy change, that the ports themselves also educate the port workers to make sure that they're working in conjunction with the custom inspectors as we move forward. The other thing that I would recommend, consistent enforcement port is an economic issue that also becomes an issue of safety when those who have the sinister minds are looking to breach whatever securities we do have. If it's not being done consistently in port, they would find it out. So I appreciate the opportunity and would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. You just gave us the shortest prepared statement.
What's that?
I think you've delivered the shortest prepared statement that we've had before this committee in quite a while, but a very fulsome, off-the-cuff statement that we very much appreciate. And we thank you for sharing that with us, and look forward to having a chance to ask you some questions. Our next witness, our final witness, is Mr. John Drake, Vice President, right? Vice President. It's a job I always wanted, but never landed, for Transportation Infrastructure and Supply Chain Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In his role, Mr. Drake represents the business community on transportation infrastructure and supply chain issues. Yeah, he's also, I'm told, a Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee member. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
All right. Advising the U.S. Customs and Border Protection on trade. Previously, Mr. Drake was a senior appointee at the Department of Transportation and worked on Capitol Hill for over 10 years. In what capacity?
I was two of note. So I was a professional staff for Senate Commerce Committee, and then also professional staff for the House Transportation Committee.
All right, thank you. All righty, with that having been said, welcome aboard, and you have the floor. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Senator. And Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Cornyn, Senator Cortez Masto, and Senator Grassley, and members of the subcommittee. As the chairman said, my name is John Drake, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today at today's hearing on U.S. trade enforcement and entry of merchandise on behalf of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Look, international trade is critical to our nation's economy and way of life. Ports are fundamental to this trade, including the 328 international land, air, and sea ports throughout the United States that have a U.S. Customs and Border Protection presence. The operations of these ports and moving goods efficiently is of significant importance to the business community. Delays, congestion, and inefficient operations add cost to businesses and consumers, ultimately making goods more expensive and our economy less competitive. It does not feel that long ago when we were in the depths of the COVID pandemic and many Americans were facing delays in everything from toilet paper to products that required semiconductor chips, and pictures of long lines of ocean vessels waiting to enter the ports of LA and Long Beach dominated the news. We've come a long way since those days, but we have not returned to normal in any sense of the word. Instead, today we are in a new normal of significant and seemingly daily supply chain challenges. To start, I think many things that are really sort of top of mind for a lot of policymakers, the shipping diversions caused by the Red Sea crisis, the war in Ukraine, the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. We also face labor challenges. For one, we have a shortage of truck drivers, rail workers, longshoremen, pilots, mechanics, and other necessary supply chain and logistics workers. We also face disruptions stemming from contract negotiations, including the UAW strike in 2023, the Class 1 freight railroads negotiations, the ILWU in the West Coast port terminals last year, and the Teamsters and UPS negotiations. Right now, we're also tracking the negotiations that are happening between the ILA and the U.S. Maritime Alliance to renew labor contracts set to expire at the end of this September. We also face a difficult situation at our southern border. Migrant surges are disruptive, with CBP increasingly diverting resources and performing short-term closures of key commercial ports to help process migrants. Make no mistake, these events are intended to illustrate that businesses today are managing multiple C-suite level disruptions at once, that they create their own set of challenges. As a CEO of a prominent shipping company recently said, we were accustomed to managing a black swan event once every couple of years. Today, we deal with one every week. There are silver linings, though. For one, there is a greater awareness and focus on the resilience and efficiency of America's supply chains, including its ports of entries. This is helping elevate discussions here in Washington, D.C. and in other places around data and the opportunities to improve the overall performance of our supply chains, where any friction can lead to impacts on consumer choice, price, and economic development. That's why we're grateful for this hearing. But it's clear that we are in a very different world than just a few years ago. As such, we have several recommendations for this committee. First, we urge you to consider changes to the U.S. to CBP statutory authorities in a holistic context. Trade is interconnected. There are significant concerns around threats like forced labor, fentanyl, and counterfeits, among many other challenges. And this deserves our attention. But part of confronting these challenges means looking at the entire universe of CBP's tools and authorities. Making a change in one part of CBP's authorities can result in unintended consequences to other parts of our trade laws that will have unintended and potentially negative consequences on our businesses and consumers. Second, this committee should consider a comprehensive customs modernization effort that balances the equally important goals of enforcing U.S. customs laws with trade facilitation, which will enhance the resiliency of our supply chains and also promote economic securities. Important goals both. That is why the Chamber is helping lead a coalition of businesses and trade associations to help inform any update to to CBP's trade authorities. Finally, there are legislative opportunities out there as well. We urge Congress to pass Senators Peters and Cornyn's Securing America's Ports of Entry Act of 2023. CBP staffing, as Senator Cornyn noted, has not kept pace with demand generated by the tripling of goods entering the U.S. in the last 25 years. While CBP will need to look at tools beyond staffing to keep pace with trade demands, staffing is important, and this legislation will help CBP reduce the lengthy wait times, help stop the flow of illicit goods, illicit drugs, and other contraband, and facilitate new economic opportunities throughout the U.S. Thank you again for the opportunity to participate in this hearing, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much for that statement, and also for being with us today. I'm going to yield to Senator Grassley for the first questions. Go ahead, Senator Grassley. Again, welcome.
I thank my
Thanks so much
colleagues for your courtesy of letting me go ahead so I can meet with the Waterloo Chamber of Commerce that are in town. Mr. Pickle, I want to talk about the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, and several companies have been listed to it. Most recently, Homeland Security listed 26 textile companies. Do you think that this act has been effective in changing companies' behavior, whether it be U.S. companies importing products from China or Chinese companies exporting to the United States?
Thanks for the question, Senator. I would say from my time in government and my time in the private sector, I have seen a level of attention to the issue of forced labor that I did not experience before the UFLPA was enacted into law. Are there still issues that need to be ironed out in terms of how industry and government are working together to fully implement every provision of the UFLPA? Absolutely. I think there's a lot of work that can be done in terms of understanding how certain technologies can be used and how due diligence standards can be clarified to make sure that we have the best shot at making sure that we're keeping forced labor out of the country. I do think the UFLPA, the provisions that envision getting at the root causes of forced labor, the diplomatic engagement, as well as using our trade negotiating and trade engagements to actually address those conditions, is a far more sustainable approach than relying almost entirely on border enforcement, which should be more of a backstop and less of a single point of failure.
Do you think it works effectively from third countries, transitioning from China to
Sure.
other countries to come to the United States? Is that a problem?
Sure, transshipment. So transshipment is potentially an issue in all forms of trade law compliance. Forced labor is no exception to that. Forced labor is challenging because in many instances, Customs and Border Protection has to evaluate many tiers back in the supply chain where if they're looking at counterfeits or they're looking at some other type of violation, they're looking at the goods as they're presented to them, as they exist right in front of them, right? So it's a different dynamic. They're having to go farther back in the process. Transshipment is not necessarily always an illicit practice, but to the extent that it's used to mask where products are coming from, it can present a challenge. Ultimately, CBP needs to have better visibility into the risks that exist around the world. Something that other agencies should be contributing more to, in my view, so that CBP can share that information with their trusted trade partners.
Thank you. Mr. Drake, since the enactment of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, there's been discussion about the effective level of de minimis threshold. I supported the passage of that act, and I still consider myself a free trader. However, I believe that continuous abuses of this threshold must be addressed. Do you think that there's a more effective level of Congress could set in de minimis threshold in order to prevent abuses such as bulk importation of counterfeits?
So we have found that the $800 level has been very successful, and it has allowed CBP to target its limited enforcement resources to where it is best appropriate. That being said, we recognize that the trade environment has changed significantly over the last 25 years. There are concerns out there that CBP is not collecting certain types of data that would help further refine its enforcement mission. But we would argue that is true for not just de minimis shipments, but all up and down the trade environment. So if a formal entry and informal entry, et cetera. We have been supportive of CBP looking to expand the data it's collecting from new parties in the customs space, like warehouses, fulfillment centers, et cetera. But we think that more can be done. And we do think that efforts to single out de minimis are inappropriate. And I think that we would say that a comprehensive review of the data that CBP is collecting at all levels of trade are a more appropriate focus for Congress's attention.
Yeah. Mr. Pickle, I'm going to have a question for writing in letter because my time is up. So I'll ask you to answer that in writing. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Senator Grassley, thank you so much. How long were you the chairman of this committee? How many years did you serve as, on this committee?
All but 4 of the 44 years I've been in the Senate.
So you're sort of a newcomer, huh?
That was from 1986 to 1990 when we didn't have enough Republicans because I was way down there at the far end. Never thought I'd ever get to the top.
Yeah, but you did. How long did you serve as chair for this committee? How long?
6 years in the House and 44 here. I guess we add up to 50, right?
That's pretty impressive. Good years, 50 good years. Thank you. Thanks so much for helping us kick this off. I think we're going to turn to Senator Cortez Masto and then maybe to Senator Cornyn if he's ready.
Thank
Go ahead,
you,
please.
Mr. Chair.
Welcome. We're glad you're here.
I understand from Senator Grassley there's hope for me because I'm down at the end. So at some point in time, I'm assuming there's hope for me.
You'll be here faster than you think. And if I can make it, you can too, believe me.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. One of the things I want to talk about is the U.S. foreign trade zones, which in Nevada is happening in an important area for so many of our businesses. I am hearing from our businesses and from our Las Vegas foreign trade zone that Customs and Border Patrol struggles to maintain adequate staff to respond to the needs of those foreign trade zones in a timely manner. And I'm curious, Mr. Pickle and Mr. Drake, has this been your experience as well? Are you seeing businesses having those same challenges?
I would start by offering that I think this is one symptom of what's been alluded to here today, which is that U.S. Customs and Border Protection has had ongoing and pretty pervasive staffing shortages going back to before I started working there in 2011. So
nationally, not just at the southern border,
correct.
But nationally, everywhere across the country.
Yes, Senator. Yeah. Yes. And so, I think compounding that challenge is that there are some FTZs in the country. I'm not sure about the FTZs or subzones in your state, but they can exist up to 60 miles or 90-minute drive time away from the ports of entry. Yeah. So I know that that's particularly challenging for some ports that are staffed at 1 or 2 or 3 CBP officers to be able to get out to those ports. They do try to adopt additional types of oversight, whether it's closed circuit videos or different types of compliance programs, weekly reports that are generated by the FTZs that show their inventory control and so forth. But in terms of the actual physical presence there, I would tie that back to the nationwide staffing shortage and the systemic challenges with that distance.
And I appreciate that. I was down a couple of months ago at the Nogales Port of Entry in the Tucson sector, and I understand that port alone, just talking with the customs agents there that work there, the men and women, it handles $30 billion in trade each year. Mm-hmm. just in those 2 ports of entry. But I also know what you're saying is that they are understaffed and overwhelmed, not just with the immigration that's happening, but the trade, the increasing trade that they see. And really, that's one of the reasons why I supported the Bipartisan Border Security Act, the James Lankford, Kirsten Sinema, Chris Murphy legislation that was put together, because in that legislation, based on what I was hearing firsthand at the border, particularly the Tucson sector, it provides additional resources for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, among other things, additional resources to hire U.S. Customs and Border Security personnel, and money, almost $1 billion, to expand border security and operational capacity. And it's what I'm hearing in my state. It's what I saw at the border. And I suspect, and I may be wrong, but Mr. Drake, it's my understanding that the U.S. Chamber supported this legislation when it first came out. I suspect it's for that reason, to provide additional resources that are necessary for our Customs and Border Patrol. Is that correct?
That is correct. I think we see the failure to act on immigration reform as a missed opportunity. I think that we would say that, a lot of the challenges that CBP's experience at the southern border are in part because the immigration laws are out of date. But we do think the border security is an important area where we need to focus on to fix this problem.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. One of the other things I was hearing from my businesses is that there are just a lot of duplicative data requirements rather than a streamlined entry or export process. Is that true as well, what you're hearing and seeing? I'm just curious. Mr. Drake, we'll start with you.
It is, I think, duplicative, and also I think another area where the business community is concerned is that oftentimes the data that is being asked to be collected isn't necessarily tied to a specific goal in the enforcement regime. So, like, if this data that you're asking us to provide to CBP, for example, is this tied to catching, screening for fentanyl or screening for counterfeits? Maybe it is. I think what we would argue is CBP has not always been the best at articulating that clear connection and how that data collection ask would meet those revised goals.
Thank you. Mr. Pickle?
I would just add that, I mentioned in my statement that there are 47 different federal agencies that work with CBP to regulate the importation of products. Each one of those agencies has their own unique entry requirements and their own ways of approaching their regulatory responsibilities. So to the extent that information can be shared better, and there could be among those agencies, and then there could be more of a cohesive governance structure around how data is collected. There's an automated system that collects this data, and to the extent that there were more of a decision-making structure to deconflict and deduplicate those data requirements, that would definitely smooth the experience in sort of the digital data input process.
Thank you. And I suspect that's why you called for the codification of the Border Interagency Executive Council, one of the reasons?
Yes.
Is that right? Thank you. My time is up. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Gentlemen, the Congress appropriated $380 million in fiscal year 2024 for non-intrusive inspection equipment, additionally for DHS's fentanyl initiative, and including $32 million for expanded lab capacity under the fentanyl initiative, that provided funding for an increase in 2,000 border agents, bringing the total funding level to 22,000 agents and 150 new CBP officers who work at the ports of entry. Now, I realize that none of that's been implemented yet, but Congress has been generous, I think, even by Washington, D.C. standards, to try to respond to the needs of being shorthanded at the border. Mr. Pickle, Mr. Drake, do you have any other suggestions for things we need to do to meet the resource problems at the border? Mr. Pickle first.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Senator. I would say that, as I said, CBP has been in a pervasive staffing shortage. I think with respect to the trade responsibilities, which obviously is one facet of a very complicated job for the agency, it's very important to look for creative ways to use innovation. We talked a little bit about data, the use of data, and the way that CBP gets that before cargo actually arrives at a land port, an airport, a seaport, and being able to do more to evaluate risk using that data, using technology like artificial intelligence to be able to validate that data using an objective source would really help CBP be able to identify risk more readily, rather than sort of continuously needing more and more officers. So the adoption of AI, I think, is one example. So to put in the context of NII at a land border port, if AI were able to compare a static image of a truck coming through a port compared to the way that truck came across the port the last 5 times to see anomalies, AI technology could do that much quicker than the naked eye of a CBP officer.
Just to press the issue a little bit, if AI can help us detect infractions and problems at the border, you're still going to need CBP agents to follow up on that, right? And do the enforcement and compliance actions. Okay.
Yes.
So we're not talking about displacing the need for flesh and blood human beings.
No, I don't think that process will be entirely automated, but I think that the idea is that you're taking the CBP officers and putting them in the roles that you need a person to do, and let the technology compare the data points across time. So the CBP officer would still do the inspection. They would still, make sure that all of the other entry requirements are being met. And
Mr. Drake, just to add to that question, would trusted traveler programs, because if you go to the border, for example, they have a lot of people that basically are already been inspected, not at the border, but before they get to the border, and then they have secure containers or other facilities that obviate the need to duplicate that at the border. Are those the sorts of things that you think will help?
Absolutely. And I think they've been very successful up till now. I think with the legislation that you're considering, as well as, if Congress were to look at these programs more fully, I think, our recommendation there is to continue to make sure that the advantages that are bestowed upon participants in those programs meet or exceed the administrative aspects, and that there is a strong dialogue that's happening between the federal government and the private sector to make sure that what's being asked of the private sector is understood and is discussed ahead of time.
Let me come back to you again, Mr. Drake.
Yes, sir.
We talked a little bit, you alluded in your opening statement to the disruption in legitimate trade and travel as a result of the migrant surge across the border. And of course, we know that so many personnel have to relocated to try to deal with processing migrants and the like. But in particular, CBP suspended rail crossings in Eagle Pass, Texas, multiple times, as you know, due to the migrant surges. So they were shifted over to assist Border Patrol. Do you happen to know what percentage of rail traffic between the United States and Mexico the Eagle Pass rail crossing accounts for?
That's a good question, Senator. So Eagle Pass is a significantly important rail crossing between the U.S. and Mexico. I would argue, my understanding is the most important rail crossing right now, and certainly I believe it handles the majority of rail traffic between the U.S. and Mexico itself.
My notes here indicate that Borderplex Alliance estimates it to be about 45%. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right, yes, sir.
Union Pacific Railroad estimated a daily overall impact of $200 million to the U.S. economy from the closure. Does that sound about right?
I think it was a little bit higher. You're talking about the closure that happened back in December. My understanding is the number was around 205 to 210 million.
And Mr. Pickle, what are the economic impacts downstream when you have these sort of problems at the border, suspending rail crossings, for example? What are the economic impacts? And do these impact supply chain resilience?
Yes, of course. So in addition to the impacts that the rail processing operations had, there were also several instances where the Bridge of the Americas in El Paso was shut down, the cargo facilities there. And I think there's sort of a macro impact in terms of encouraging the movement of manufacturing facilities back to the Western Hemisphere from areas like Southeast Asia, and realizing that there could be, potentially fragile border situations that would prevent those products from coming into the United States. And the potential downstream economic impacts that you referred to are that, those products are going to be further manufactured. There are people who work in distribution centers. There are people who stock shelves who, are waiting for those products to come. And of course, consumers. I mean, these situations can lead to product shortages for consumers, potential work stoppages in extreme situations, and also rethinking of investment if there seem to be persistent risks.
Well, because my state, Texas, is ground zero for a lot of these problems, we are perhaps more acquainted with the challenges that the current crisis at the border presents. But Mr. Drake, I seem to remember a poster by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that talks about where the jobs that are created by the binational trade are distributed. And I'm sure those include the state of Maryland and the state of Nevada, the state of Delaware, virtually all 50 states. So there's a huge economic impact across the entire country when those supply chains are disrupted or because of bottlenecks associated with shortages of CBP and other inspection facilities. My time's up. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to talk about uncertainties and catastrophic events that affect the supply chain. I know, Mr. Drake, you mentioned the Port of Baltimore with the Francis Scott Key Bridge that collapsed when the Dolly struck it, totally closing the Port of Baltimore, the third busiest port in our country. And I want to start off by saying there was incredible cooperation to deal with all aspects of that catastrophic event, from the federal government, state government, local government, private sectors, all working together. And today the port is opened months earlier than we thought possible. There's been help to the businesses whose supply chains were disrupted. There's been some help for the workers, as well as small businesses, et cetera. So I want to start off by saying there was a really unified response. But there are challenges here. The Port of Baltimore does about $80 billion of business a year. We're the number one on roll-on, roll-off cargo. And during the early stages when the bridge was knocked down, I met with a lot of the business owners and the labor people, and they were puzzled because it was difficult for a small business operator of a trucking company to take their trucking company and go to another port and get business because of the protocols of the port and all the politics involved there. There was challenges with the workers at the port as to whether they could transfer some of their work to other places. That was also a turf problem that we had to deal with. We had some, shippers that needed alternative supply routes, and we worked to get that done, but there was some concern that it might not return to the Port of Baltimore, and that might be the price for alternative routes. So there were trades there that didn't seem to be a consistent policy. And do we need to rethink how we can have a more seamless national system? Because unpredictable catastrophic events seem to be occurring more frequently these days. Do we need to have a better understanding as to how we can work together in a unified way to make sure we protect supply chains, but also protect a community that goes through an unpredictable event? Drake, you look anxious to answer.
So I will tell you, after the last 4 or 5 years, the business community is getting exceptionally better about responding to catastrophic events. This is one of those situations where, as you said, the response has been, over the top, and the fact that you had this terrible thing happen, 6 people lost their lives. And yet government, local government, state government, the business community, the federal government and Congress came together to solve this. And as you noted, we're well ahead of where I think we thought we were going to be at this point. That being said, we have a bridge that we have to replace quickly. Because I think the business community is not going to be able to wait forever. I think we work very closely with the Maryland Chamber of Commerce in helping its response efforts. We know that people who work in Baltimore, a 30-minute commute now is 2 hours each way or 3 hours each way. That is not sustainable. And if it's going to take 4+ years to get a bridge rebuilt, you wonder how long people will wait. And that bridge isn't just critical for people who are going to and from work, but it's also critical for supply chains, right? It does add cost.
Let me just underscore that point.
Yes, sir.
There's, I think, 34,000 vehicles that cross that bridge. There's 3 crossings in the Port of Baltimore on the north-south corridor. 2 are tunnels. One was the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Many of the containers cannot go through the tunnels because of the cargo that they're containing. The delays are out. It could be an hour delay with the detours. That affects costs and supply, and you're exactly right. We are now experiencing tremendous traffic problems because the port is open. We're happy the port is open, but there's gridlock now, and you're right, patience will run thin. So I very much appreciate your statement. We got to get moving on that quickly. One of the reasons why our delegation, bipartisan delegation, thinks it's urgent that we pass the bill that allows for the 100% state reimbursement, which is what we do during these catastrophic events now, is that we want to start the construction phase as quickly as possible. And to start the construction phase, that bill has to be passed for it to be 100% federal share. It's not the time limit when you start, which many of my colleagues think. It's when you start the construction phase, you have to have that law in place. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm just making a plea to my colleagues. We've got to get that bill done as quickly as possible, so it's not the reason for the delay on the work being done to replace the bridge. And Mr. Drake, I appreciate you bringing that up because it does affect supply chain. It's beyond just the Port of Baltimore. It's an efficiency issue. There's a frustration issue. And the response to date has been great. It's going to take a while to get that bridge replaced, but we don't want to see unnecessary delays. So thank you.
Yeah, and Senator, we would love to work with you on that legislation.
Thank you. Thank you. The chairman of the Environment Public Works Committee came back. I'll repeat it all again. It's urgent that we get the Chamber of Commerce is agreeing with me. So we got to get that bill passed.
Repetition is good.
We can't start the construction phase until that bill is done, and it is affecting the supply chain in our port. Just wanted to make that point.
Yeah.
Senator Cardin, thank you. Thanks for being a great friend and a great colleague on this committee. He and I serve, I sit next to each other on 2 different committees, and he finds it hard to get away from me. And he lives just down the road, not too far away. All right, thanks, pal. Let me see, I think I have I'm looking for a question here I have from Mr. Pickle. Mr. Pickle, I might be wrong. I think when Bob Dole was in the United States Senate, he may have served on the Finance Committee. I'm not sure of that, but he may have served on the Finance Committee, which would mean he'd sat literally right here. His wife, Elizabeth Dole, was quite an accomplished person, was a cabinet secretary in, I think, one of the Bush cabinets. And she was nominated to be a cabinet secretary. And at her, you may know this, when people are nominated for a cabinet position, it's not uncommon for them to be introduced at the committee, before the Committee of Jurisdiction, by their home state senator, or one of their home state senators. And when Elizabeth Dole was nominated to be a cabinet secretary many moons ago, her home state senator showed up to introduce Elizabeth Dole. And I don't have the words exactly, but I think he said to his colleagues that day, I regret that I have but one wife to give for my country. I regret that I have but one wife to give for my country. I love Bob Dole, and Elizabeth. He's deceased, sadly. We're both Bob Dole and I are both veterans, different wars, but great sense of humor, great service. I understand that you may have a spouse that's not been nominated to be a cabinet secretary, but to serve in some other capacity, maybe even in the U.S. Senate where we serve. And take just a minute and explain with us. This is not her confirmation hearing, but what is the nature of her responsibilities in this? And I'm told she's quite a gift from your family.
Yes. My wife, Megan, is the first woman to serve as the Journal Clerk of the United States Senate.
Say that one more time.
Sure. My wife, Megan, is the first woman to serve as the Journal Clerk of the United States Senate.
Yeah, explain what that means.
She sits on the Senate floor and captures the official record of the Senate's proceedings.
Pretty scary, huh? Usually not.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing your wife.
Yes, my pleasure.
With all of us. Mm-hmm. Mr. Paylor, are you up for another question? Sure. I thought you would be. In your testimony, I believe you mentioned the close relationship that many longshoremen have with Customs and Border Protection agents at ports across the country. My question for you, Mr. Paylor, could you just take a few minutes for us and discuss differences between the work that longshoremen perform and the work that Customs and Border Protection agents perform at ports, and how both groups work together to make sure that goods that move through these ports are thoroughly inspected?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can, I would like to applaud Senator Cardin's understanding of the impact of the Francis Scott Key Bridge on the Port of Baltimore. I think he outlined it very well. But to answer your question, the relationship that we've had with Customs goes back even before my time, starting in 1973. My father performed the work of assisting Customs way before I was even on the waterfront. But that relationship developed into the friendship, and it was based on mutual respect. That the labor that was performed before containerization, which was much more burdensome back then than it is today, where it's more skilled it's required to handle the containers versus the old style of cargo or freight, which was box cased and loose at the time. So I think that the relationship that grew was the understanding that the skill that we provided to perform the labor that was needed for them to have the ability to assist as much cargo as possible with the manning that they had available at the terminals where we were working at. And they were spread thin where they were working at container terminals. Most ports are multifaceted, and there are some finger piers that still remain today that were used pretty frequently back in the 70s and the 80s that once again all changed through containerization. But those relationships still exist today. It's one of respect. And the people who work side by side with the custom inspectors at the terminals are usually returned employees that are there day to day. And in the casual labor industry, sometimes that's not the case at all facilities. But they develop those relationships and have an understanding, and it helps the process be expedited to get as much cargo done or inspected in an 8-hour period and sometimes longer by virtue of each other understanding the relationship and the responsibilities that both the inspectors have and our people who facilitate the handling of the cargo while they're inspecting.
I'm going to just follow up on it, and then I'm going to ask if any of our other witnesses want to comment on what we are talking about here. But Mr. Paylor, could you just discuss with us briefly how staff from other partner government agencies stationed at U.S. ports like Food and Drug Administration, like the Coast Guard, work with longshoremen at these ports?
Yes. The USDA is a perfect example, which is a division of the CPP. And when you have food products, like in your own port, where you have bananas that are the staple or the anchor business of the Port of Wilmington, and we have a lot of stone fruit that comes from other locations in the south South America and Central America, and all places from around the globe. So USDA plays a very intricate part on making sure that that cargo is being inspected for the quality of the fruit, making sure that there's no insects in there that would be harmful to our environment. So it's something that happens on a regular basis, a daily basis, and provides a lot of overtime. So it's, once again, those relationships that we develop with CBP inspectors are the same that we develop with the USDA inspectors.
All right, thank you. A question, if I could, for Mr. Pickle. And the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's war in the Ukraine, senseless war in the Ukraine, I would say, have jumbled supply chains and disrupted the global economy in many ways, unprecedented ways, I think. And in your testimony, I think you mentioned that in order to build stronger and more resilient supply chains across all sectors, companies must work with the federal government to anticipate supply chain challenges and do their fair share to ensure that goods entering the United States are safe for consumers. My question, would you please take a few moments to share with us how different industries can work with the federal government, to share information and build more resilient supply chains in an effort to prevent the supply chain bottlenecks and shortages that Americans have become all too familiar with?
Thanks for that question. Sure. I think it's a very important one, and one that is not entirely new in the context of port operations and some of the agencies that we've talked about already here today. Certainly with CBP, many of the sort of best innovations from process standpoint that I've seen CBP adopt and some of the partner government agencies come as a direct result of having not only formal but informal consultations, engagement with private industry. Much of that is done through the Commercial Operations Advisory Committee that's established in statute, and Mr. Drake, my fellow panelist, serves on. I would say that it's important to also have conversations on an ad hoc basis as well, to really identify what are some of the pressing concerns that industry is seeing and challenges that CBP is seeing, and how those issues can be resolved, but also to look forward and say, what's the next wave of emerging challenges that we're going to be facing, particularly because many federal agencies sort of operate in a silo, right? They're performing their responsibilities at a port of entry or within a process. So in many instances, industry can help to sort of see across the supply chain that may be regulated by multiple different agencies, and help find where there may be innovations that they can borrow from other agencies as well. So I would say the simple answer to your question is to talk to each other, is to really stay in constant communication. One example I would give is the Air Cargo Advanced Screening Program, where CBP identified challenges in the air cargo environment in terms of getting data in enough time to be able to screen packages that were coming to the U.S. on aircraft. And for lack of a better phrase, industry and CBP officials kind of locked themselves in a room and said, we have to figure this out. And they did. And they figured out a construct that is, the operative requirement now for security filings related to air cargo. So I think that constant communication and collaboration is the most important component.
All right, thank you for that. Anybody else want to comment on the question? Anybody? Gentlemen, Mr. Paylor, Mr. Drake, anything? No? Okay. I have another question, Mr. Drake, for you, involving examining data collected and shared at U.S. ports. And having access to accurate and reliable data is a critical component for sound decision-making, as you know, and anticipating new challenges. In your testimony, Mr. Drake, you discuss how the data that Customs and Border Protection collect can be used to inform, can be used to potentially improve port operations, specifically at land ports. Here's my question. Could you please take a few minutes for us today to discuss how Customs and Border Protection might improve the ways in which they use and share data collected at U.S. ports, as well as any recommendations that you have for members of this committee to ensure that data is made available?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think two recommendations, and I think this was referenced earlier on in the hearing, but the first is CBP does collect significant amount of data. Oftentimes that data is good and helpful, but they need to do a better job of sharing that data with the 47 other federal agencies that have a role in helping safeguard what's coming into our country. Those PGAs oftentimes will not get that data, and sometimes when they do get that data, they're operating on it in different ways or with a different set of priorities than CBP. We think it's absolutely critical that Congress intervene, and this is something the administration can do, but we think that it would benefit from congressional support, which is to set priorities on making sure that NHTSA, USDA, EPA, other agencies that have a role in making sure that we're not getting counterfeits, we're not getting invasive species or other bad stuff coming in, that they're doing their job as well. I think the second recommendation we would have, and this is that CBP, we believe, could do a better job of sharing the data it's collecting with the private industry. The private industry is always going to be the front line of every sort of trade problem that we see. And they want to make sure that they're making the best decisions possible. A really good area for that is if CBP provided more specific information to the business community to help them the business community understand if they're doing business with the right folks or if they should be shifting to a different supplier, a different carrier, et cetera.
All right. Let me follow up that
Yes,
question with another word. Would you also, for us, just please discuss the role of the private sector in ensuring that Customs and Border Protection has accurate data about the goods that are moving through our ports and how these relationships might be further strengthened?
Yeah, so CBP success is always going to be based on the data it's collecting, and oftentimes that data is the first part of the shipment that happens, right? If the good is at the port and CBP doesn't have any data on that good, they're going to have a very difficult time evaluating what that product is and if it needs to be intervened or not. We would say that it's absolutely critical that the data that the private sector is providing, excuse me, let me take a step back. We would say that CBP is in all cases collecting the data on all parties it needs to be collecting today. So the huge explosion of e-commerce in this nation, right? You have a variety of new players who are in the trade space who weren't there 15, 20 years ago.
For example?
For example, warehouses, fulfillment centers, e-commerce platforms. Those players aren't the traditional express carriers who have been operating under CBP authority for decades. They are not necessarily in all cases providing data to CBP. And we would argue that in a lot of cases they should be. It's going to help CBP's enforcement mission, but it also is going to level the playing field.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Paylor, are you up for another question? Oh, good. As we all know, and our friend Ben Cardin was just here, and I'm sure he covered this, but I'm going to revisit it, and if I'm covering some ground that's already been covered, I apologize. But as we all know, on March 26th, tragedy struck as the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore collapsed after being hit by a malfunctioning cargo ship. 6 individuals tragically lost their lives. As a result, the Port of Baltimore had to initially stop all cargo ships from moving in and out of the port in order to clear the debris and carefully remove parts of the collapsed bridge. Port of Baltimore is an economic powerhouse. We think our port in Delaware is a powerhouse, but a real powerhouse, and we're good. But Port of Baltimore is even more so. But Port of Baltimore employs thousands of people from the region, including some from Delaware and Pennsylvania, as well as Maryland. And its initial closure and now gradual reopening have had ripple effects across sectors. My question for you, Mr. Paylor, is could you please discuss with us how the initial closure and gradual reopening of the Port of Baltimore has impacted members of the International Longshoremen's Association, them and their families?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a very important question, and I think it's one that can't be answered at this point completely. And that's because the assessment is still growing and trying to be understood. But the accident that caused the shutting down of the terminal had a direct effect on 1,800 members of International Longshoremen's Association. There's a few different locals in Baltimore. The majority of those people have been out of work completely. And even with the support of unemployment, that mitigates some of their losses. When you have people that are working pretty regularly, as you point out, that the level of containers and ro-ro product that goes through the port generates not just a lot of man hours for our members, but also for people who are not union members or maybe members of other unions, truck drivers. And that filters down to the mom and pop stores that are right outside the port complexes, to the local banks that are being impacted. But when you have 1,800 people that are now out of work and not collecting their income, the wages are only a part of the impact when you lose 2 months of your income. It's how do you pay your mortgage, how do you pay your car payment, and how do you make things feasible when you're looking at the debt that you're accumulating. The other thing that has to be taken in consideration in our industry, that making eligibility for your medical benefits is based on a yearly situation. It's all hours accumulated for a year of service for next year's coverage. So we don't even know what the impact of that's going to be at this point, but it's serious when your members lose health benefits. Hopefully there's a system in place that could help mitigate that also, but once again, still it's hasn't been identified. I think the important piece that was said just a minute ago, which is a little deeper thinking, which is now that they've lost significant cargo, container cargo and ro-ro, the good news is for the supply chain, they've moved to adjacent ports, which could have been the Port of Wilmington, Delaware, the Port of Norfolk, Virginia, and as far south as Savannah and as far north as New York. Okay, what will be the mystery that nobody has an answer for is how much of that cargo will return. If they can only process a certain amount of vessel and cargoes based on it being open but restricted, that could cause problems that are more long-term if carriers or shippers decide that they would have to go to a different port. Then you have the situation where one port's pain is another port's gain, where port authorities are always highly competitive against one another. So the opportunity to take advantage of one's pain to provide cheaper rates possibly to the shippers or to the carriers in order to attract cargo that has not been able to be serviced in the Port of Baltimore is another unknown that I don't think we have a full understanding of what the impact could be. And once again, the fact that it is an accident upsets the supply chain to the highest level when it gets back to the whole purpose behind custom inspections. Now that people see what could be done by an accident, what would happen in any competing port or the same port if it was done intentionally by some type of terroristic action.
Okay. I think you've in part answered the next question I'm going to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and you just think about it, and any response you have, you go ahead and let us have that, and we'll pick on somebody else for a minute. But could you also please discuss with us how port workers had to shift their operations and how shipping companies adapted to this emergency situation in Baltimore?
Yes. Well, we speak for labor and labor, okay? The good news, having the unity of the International Longshoremen's Association who works in all the same competitive ports, there was the unity that we shared where ports of Norfolk, for example, Philadelphia, Delaware, had all offered the unemployed people from the Port of Baltimore to come to their ports and help them provide the service to the cargo that left Baltimore to go to those other respective ports. So it was good. Unfortunately, the logistics of travel made it impossible in some cases. The other one is that there are contracts in place in other locations where the contract and the benefits especially are proprietary to the employees that work in those respective ports. So by traveling, even if it was practical, the credit that would be needed for your cumulative hours for benefits was something that we found impossible. And then there was some employers who were really willing to work out and help the industry and help the U.S. economy. And there was others who wanted to take advantage of the fact that that cargo had to go somewhere. So you had both the good and the bad that comes along with an issue like that. I'd like to believe that the unity that we shared was a full example of solidarity. And I do believe that the majority of employers who could have offered help did it with all good intentions and not what I said, taking advantage of the opportunity to become the new competitor for the Port of Baltimore.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that, those responses. I have the next question. It's going to be a question for all three of you. We'll start with Mr. Drake and then over to Mr. Pickle and then back to Mr. Paylor. Mr. Drake, the question is, it concerns preparedness for future emergencies at U.S. ports. We'd like to think there'll never be an emergency or something as dire, even worse than what's been experienced in Baltimore. But we all know that, that's not probably realistic.
Yeah.
And so my question is, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge raised questions about the preparedness of our nation's ports and by extension our nation's supply chains for future emergency situations. My question, Mr. Drake, for you first, how can the federal government better ensure that all U.S. ports are better prepared to address future emergency situations similar to that which we have witnessed in Baltimore?
Thank you for the question. So it's helpful that everyone, you, the Congress, the business community are thinking about these issues much more regularly than they were before. That's certainly helpful. I would argue that if we were to experience a repeat of the West Coast port crisis that we had in 2020, we would likely be in the exact same situation we were back then. Not a whole lot has changed at the level to prevent the pileup that for lack of a better term that we saw back in 2020 from repeating itself. That being said, it's critical that the conversations between the private sector, those who are working the ports, everyone from the workers to the carriers to the shippers to the local governments are staying in close contact. The federal government is helping to inform those discussions as well. There is a new program at the Department of Transportation called the Flow Effort. This is a public-private partnership where the private industry will share data with the DOT, and DOT will aggregate that data and share it back with the private sector. Where this was exceptionally helpful is in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. DOT was able to provide in real time and help the private community understand where they should go next to begin the diversification away from the Port of Baltimore and identify other ports that could handle that traffic. We need more efforts like that to prepare us for the next emergency.
All right, thank you. Same question, if I could.
So I think,
Please.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think we have to acknowledge sort of a core kind of limiting factor that exists and how the federal government responds to port vulnerabilities and supply chain conditions in general, right? Ports are not owned by the federal government. Supply chains are not owned by the federal government, but obviously they can have influence on how those resources are used, right? So I think with that sort of understanding, looking at how the federal government can continue to be a convener of sorts, this was a great sort of silver lining that came out of the West Coast port congestion dynamic that John just referenced, where you had industry and all different government agencies getting on these pretty prolific Zoom calls where there were 200 screens of individuals who were talking about how to address different conditions that were contributing to port congestion, and having the ability to have agility within each of those areas of responsibility across the different agencies, as well as the many different private actors who perform their responsibilities within the port boundaries. I think from a federal government standpoint, the key word here is agility. The ability for federal agencies who operate within port boundaries to be able to shift their resources. And if cargo is relocating to an adjacent port, being able to move personnel there to absorb the additional capacity that's being taken on, or additional volume, I should say, as well as how to create a resumption plan. So we've talked a lot about CBP, but other DHS equities that are agencies that have responsibilities within the port boundaries. The Transportation Security Administration, they oversee the transportation program for truck drivers to be able to maneuver around ports. The Coast Guard, they handle port security. They have port security plans that are in place that should take into account how ports resume their operations. So I think they can have that sort of cohesive nature between all of these disparate organizations that operate within a port and link back to the broader supply chains. But I think, coming at it from a perspective that, as I say earlier, they don't own the infrastructure or the supply chain itself.
All right, thank you. Mr. Paylor, same question. Let me just repeat it. How can the federal government better ensure that all U.S. ports...
I understand the question, Mr. Chairman, and I should yield to the two gentlemen who are more qualified, but I would like to give you a labor perspective on it.
We never yield to our colleagues, even when they're more qualified.
But anyway, I have three thoughts on it. One is consistent enforcement, which may not be practical with so many ports and so many different facilities, and customs having their own procedural ways of doing things a little bit different state to state, port to port. But one of the things that I learned just in the last week, looking at a few things based on the questions that Olivia was running by me, and I just did a very unprofessional question and answer for a number of different ports. And one of them is very simple but very significant layer of security, and that's called a seal that goes onto the container from the port where it originated or from the manufacturer. That could have been China, Singapore, or anywhere else. That container then goes to the port that's going to be loading it onto a vessel. And all the paperwork should have that security seal, which is usually a very large number identification on it. That container goes onto the vessel, and then when it comes to the United States, that should be looked at as one of the first layers of security to make sure that container was not opened en route and therefore tampered with. And that's where I see one of the inconsistencies of something that looks small, but that's significant. That should be done when there's a change of custody of the container, when it's being shipped to a port in the United States, and then again when it's being shipped out of the terminal and put it onto our public roads. The other thing that I think that's necessary, and I think Mr. Drake alluded to that the private operators are sometimes your first line of defense, and I agree with that. But really the first line of defense is the people who board that vessel every day and are familiar with the things that we're talking about right now and concerned. Those are the same people that from our industry, when there was a global disruption on the supply chain, President Daggett instructed our people that this is what we do under all circumstances. We've done it during wars, and now we're dealing with the war of the pandemic. We show up and we go to work. So what I think should be done is that there should be orientation for all port facilities, for all workers, to make sure they clearly understand the importance of what's being done with the people who work side by side with CBP, but with CBP and themselves. So it's not looked at as a secondary or ancillary work, but it's a primary function for Homeland Security purposes and for the safety of the people that work at the port. And I think that the way of funding something like that that's so different is my understanding that the harbor maintenance tax has accumulated and it has a fund sitting there with not a lot of draw on it, and I think that would be a way of funding that. The third thing that I would suggest is that when you're looking at the applications that are being made, whether it's TIFA or PIDP or the Tiger grants that are used for port modifications, that I think when those applications are being made to modify an existing port or for the purpose of funding the development of a new port, it should be required and a prerequisite that a inspection facility is part of and developed into that facility before receiving any public monies, because it's something that has to be controlled at our ports and not taken out onto our public streets.
Okay, thank you. I got at least one or maybe one or two more questions, if you're up to that. Again, thanks for joining us today. But with respect to customs trade partnership against terrorism compliance, this would be a question I think probably for you, Mr. Pickle, and maybe for Mr. Drake. The customs trade partnership against terrorism, we're big on acronyms around here. I'm not, but there is an acronym for Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, and it's CTPAT. And it's a program that's a public, as you know, public-private sector partnership, and represents one layer of Customs and Border Protection's multi-layered cargo enforcement strategy. This program asks trading partners to implement stricter security procedures throughout their supply chains, and in return, their goods or cargo are screened more quickly. Last year, for the second time, CTPAT Pilot Program Act, which Senator Cornyn and I introduced, passed by unanimous consent in the Senate, which means nobody voted against it. And we're very pleased with that. The legislation would create a pilot program to strengthen CTPAT, and aims to reduce cargo congestion at ports of entry while strengthening our national security. I believe that's a win-win situation. Question for Mr. Pickle and for Mr. Drake. Could each of you please describe for us how our international trading partners and companies in the private sector might benefit from the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism program? Please, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I would say for importers who are bringing products to the United States, there's really two fronts that they potentially benefit from participation in CTPAT. The first, as you noted, they receive fewer customs inspections because they are vetted partners. When they are selected for inspection, they are given front-of-the-line privileges, as we say. They're inspected first. I will note that the CTPAT program is required to review benefits that are provided to its members on a regular basis and consult with industry when adjusting those benefits. So that's a very important process to go through as well. As far as CTPAT is part of a global construct called the Authorized Economic Operator concept. And so other countries have reciprocal programs. And CBP actually will review those programs programs of other countries as well, and provide reciprocal treatment to members of 18 other countries' AEO programs. So there really is a global impact when we talk about lessening some of the stress for those parties who have taken on additional responsibility to vet on the security side in particular. The CTPAT sort of brings into scope both trade compliance principles as well as security compliance principles. When you get into the international context, the mutual recognition arrangements, not agreements, arrangements, there's an important distinction there, but they're focused more on the security side of things. So there is definitely a safety emphasis there.
All right, thank you. Mr. Drake, same question.
I think Mr. Pickle answered it very well, and I would align myself entirely with his remarks.
Okay. Sometimes, well, first of all, you've done an admirable job on an important, sometimes not easily described issue, and you've done it more than justice to it. I think. I want to say to our staffs, Senator Cornyn's staff, and on the minority, and our staff on the majority, I want to thank you for very much for choosing you. Out of all the thousands of witnesses we could have brought forward, you rose to the top. We're grateful for that. I have a question I'd like to ask when we have a panel with diverse points of view and complementary but different kinds of backgrounds. And one of the questions I like to ask, I'm always looking for consensus. I know when people watch the news, they follow the news, they think all we do is fight down here, that we hate each other. And we do not only fight, we actually work together. And for the most part, we have pretty decent relationships. But I've said a million times in this room, bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. I'm always looking for how do we find consensus on difficult issues. So let me just ask for each of you. We'll start, Mr. Drake, with you, and Mr. Paylor, and then Mr. Pickle. My question would be, where is there consensus amongst the three of you? Where do you think there is consensus in what you said and heard that you would leave and say, of all that we've heard you've given to us, right? These are areas where there's a real consensus, and it's important that you not ignore that consensus, but actually grab it, seize the day. And so I'm going to ask Mr. Drake, where are some areas where you think there is a consensus that we shouldn't look that gift horse in the mouth?
You know, in the trades, when we're talking ports of entry in particular, if that's,
Yeah.
First and foremost, I think we all agree that ports are absolutely fundamental to our economic competitiveness, but also our communities, to the people who work there and the businesses to support them. And, I think there is broad consensus that we are absolutely aligned that we don't want to do anything that would undermine the strength of our ports or the people who work there, and also want to make sure that we are looking at their long-term success. So I think if we can start there, and recognizing that there are always going to be principal differences or principal disagreements between my organization and Mr. Paylor's organization and Mr. Pickle's organization, I still believe that fundamental recognition and agreement can help guide a whole variety of consensus and bipartisan agreements on a whole variety of things, regardless of whether we're talking about immigration reform, port security, and the like.
All right, thank you for that. Mr. Paylor, areas of consensus, please.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I agree that I think the consensus says that everybody has the same goal of protecting the interests of the United States and the people that we all represent. As a survivor of September 11th, I shared this just the other day, that if somebody asked me on September 10th, did I ever think that what happened on September 11th would have happened, I would have said on September 10th, no way that would ever happen, and it did. And I feel the same way about the ports now, having that experience, that the ports are secure for the most part. I think inconsistency creates some problems, Sometimes bureaucracy interferes with consistency. But I think that from the longshoreman who's actually on a pier, working with a customs inspector who's trained to perform the policies that you create up here, with the different governmental agencies and independent agencies, I think the goal is the same. So how do you streamline what we've learned through mistakes, and how do we get the people to be consistent with the bottom line, what is the right procedures? And they will change from time to time. But I think as long as there's the willingness of groups that are sitting at this table and the bipartisan support that you require to get policies done, I think that we're on the right path. We don't criticize customs and border inspectors at this point. We know that they're all hard-working women and men and women, and we're glad to work alongside of them. But I think education for all levels, from the private sector to the public sector, which is your port authorities, and including labor, whether it's union or in other cases, other unions, I think they all have to have the same understanding of how our ports work.
Good, thank you. Mr. Pickle, what are a couple of areas of consensus that you would lift up for the consideration of our members on this committee and their staffs? A lot of people are watching this by television and watching it remotely. And but what are some areas that you would lift up for us?
Well, let me just note that it's difficult to be the third person answering when two fantastic answers preceded me. I would say that...
And what we say when that happens, we have a way of, saying that I'd like to, take the words of my colleague and embrace them. There's ways that we can do that. You can too.
Absolutely. So I think I would highlight. I would agree with what my co-panelists have said. I think one thing I would observe is that the element of partnership that exists at ports and the mutual respect for the importance of roles that so many different actors play really undercuts or underpins, I should say, the importance of the port environment, but also just as consumers, as parents, as existing in society. I mean, we've all known what it's like to go to a local store, and it's difficult to find a particular product that you need if your child is sick, for example, and how we can use the power of international trade and secure supply chains, resilient supply chains, not only to create employment opportunities and sort of share the ability to supply ourselves and the rest of the world with things that we all need, but also to access those critical supplies. So, for example, I think the Medical Supply Chain Resilience Act is something I was hoping to highlight with Senator Tillis, but I know you and he co-sponsored that legislation. Perfect example of ways to engage with our trading partners to make sure that we have access to medical supplies with our most trusted allies. I think that's a great example, but looking for ways to expand those partnerships to overcome the vulnerabilities that quite frankly aren't going anywhere. I think I also heard here today that we don't think that that there's going to be a return to pre-pandemic normalcy, right? So really embracing the opportunities where they exist and capitalizing on those systemic strengths within the global international trade system.
All right, thanks for that. I think maybe one other question I'd like to ask each of you. And it's if you were sitting where I'm sitting and you had the opportunity to figure out maybe a question that you should have been asked, you weren't asked. What might be a question that you would like to have seen asked of this panel? And if you want to answer that question, you can do that as well. But what do you think maybe we could have asked, should have asked, and have not asked? Go ahead, and then Mr. Drake, you want to take a shot at that? There's no right or wrong answer, so
Yeah.
It's not pass-fail.
There's been a lot of, I think, good questions and discussion, I think, during the course of this hearing. This is a really challenging environment right now, right? When you look at the supply chain issues before us. And I think from my vantage point, the most important thing is just to know that you all are continuing to show up and ask questions. So I don't know if I necessarily have a specific question that I'd say that this committee should be asking of us. I think instead what I would encourage, or what I would urge, is that the committee continue doing these types of discussions, these types of hearings, to hear, about these issues. Because I don't think, the challenge we discussed today about the growth of e-commerce, the growing trade volumes that are expected to be coming through our ports, they're not going away. And sitting and doing nothing, is just simply not a solution. And I think, at some point, Congress is going to have to come forth and take a hard look at these authorities and these laws and see if there's a willingness and an interest to update them for our today's trade environment.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Paylor, please, same question. Maybe another question you think maybe could be asked, should be asked, but it hasn't been.
I don't know if I can frame it that way, because I think having this experience has been great, and the questions that have been asked are right on to some of the concerns I had coming in here. I think that what I would offer is that I was in Sydney, Canada, and a member of Parliament asked me why did I come from the United States to promote port development, where they were going to put a container facility in Sydney, Canada. And I explained to them, I said, that you have the public sector that provides the true asset, which is the land on your harbors. Then you have the private investment, or investor that gets involved and puts the money up for the capital improvement themselves. Why would you not want to include labor, who I was representing at the time, into that discussion in order to make sure that the people who are going to be working and protecting your investment, protecting your asset from being involved? So I would just say that labor does not belong up there unless it's elected through our Constitution. But I do believe that having labor involved from the longshore industry would be a total asset on a regular, ongoing basis when enforcing consistency place to place.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? Please.
I would just add, I think something that we've talked about in our own ways throughout this exchange today is, how can we use existing resources, existing authorities, existing sort of latent specialization to address the challenges that we see today, as well as to be able to see what challenges may be, 5, 10, 15 steps down the road. I think that this is a difficult area to do that because jurisdiction, both within Congress as well as across federal agencies, are a bit dispersed when we talk about supply chains. Certainly not when we talk about customs authorities and other areas. But I think really honing in on what the specific elements of that kind of combine to really promote supply chain resilience would benefit from being mapped out with other agencies and not limited to customs and treasury and so forth. But
good, thank you. Before we close, I spent a lot of years of my life in the Navy. I was a naval flight officer, last Vietnam veteran here, serving in the U.S. Senate, and a lot of time in airplanes. We have a big base, big Air Force base in Dover that most Americans heard of. In some cases, very tragic reasons, because we have it's the last, if you will, resting place, if you will, for our fallen heroes that are brought to Dover before they're reunited with their families. But we also have huge C-5 aircraft and C-17s. And we are, I described it the other day at an event at the Dover Air Force Base. Dover Air Force Base is the air bridge, a big part of the air bridge between our country and the Ukraine, and playing an extraordinarily valuable role in that capacity. I came out of the Navy, and I ended up moving to Delaware and got myself an MBA and went to work in what was the Division of Economic Development. And for only about 6 months, and the Democrats didn't have anybody to run for state treasurer. Nobody wanted to run. We had the worst credit rating in the country. We're tied for dead last with Puerto Rico, and they were embarrassed to be in our company. But Nobody wanted to run. And I said, I'll raise my hand. I'd been in Delaware for like not even a year or more. And so they let me run. But I have never forgot what I learned in the 6 months that I worked in the Delaware Division of Economic Development. And one of the things that I have taken with me all these years is government doesn't create jobs. Sometimes we as politicians act, we feel like we could create jobs. I was told recently that when I was governor for 8 years, more jobs were created in those 8 years than any 8-year period in the history of the state of Delaware. And I always say I didn't create one of them. What I sought to do as the governor of our state was to help create a nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation. What does that include? Access to capital for folks who want to start a business or grow a business. It includes the workforce. And when I visit employers up and down the state of Delaware, I do that every week. I ask 3 questions. How are you doing? How are we doing? Our congressional delegation, the federal government, state government, how are we doing? What can we do to help? I hear from almost everybody. A workforce, we need people to come to work. People who are trainable, who come and do a day's work for a day's pay. In terms of what's important in job creation, access to energy. And as we go further into the future, access to energy that's clean energy that'll help us not only provide our energy needs, but also help us successfully combat the climate crisis that's real and before us every day. Intellectual property. Delaware, we have more companies incorporated in Delaware than any state in the country. And one of the reasons why they do that has something to do with protection of intellectual property that's important to them, as you might imagine. And another issue is transportation. The ability to get goods and services where they need to go, when they need to go, in a cost-efficient way. For some people, those issues are not all that interesting. But if we care about jobs for our children, our grandchildren, we better be interested in them. And we also better be interested in our ports. When I was privileged to serve as governor of Delaware, a fellow came to, who was my deputy chief of staff. His name's John Carney. He's now the governor of Delaware. But he was my deputy chief of staff, and he came to me one day and he said, the state of Delaware should buy the port of Wilmington. I said, really? And he said, yeah, it's owned by the city of Wilmington. The city doesn't have any money to invest in the port. The city could use revenues, and if we were to buy the port of Wilmington, the city would have revenues they need. The state was awash in time and money, and we could use some of the state's money to take a kind of tired, dilapidated part and actually make it shine. And that's what we did, and that's what we have continued to do. As it turns out, a lot of people think, well, it's not that important who we sell some stuff around our stuff that we produce in this country around the world to others, or vice versa. Actually, it's hugely important. Most of our, we like to think the markets in the U.S. are vast, and they are, but most of the markets that we sell to are outside of our nation, and a lot of them go by ships. I said earlier, I spent a lot of my life in airplanes, and it's important what we do with airplanes like Dover Air Force Base, but it's what we do in ships, in the waterway, that at the end of the day is really the 800-pound gorilla in all of this. So, as I think you've given us some good ideas that I think we'll follow up on. You've given us some good ideas that we can work on together with our colleagues. I like to say everything I do, I know I can do better, and I think we can always do a better job. And with respect to the way that we're selling, shipping our goods, our services to other countries around the world, and receiving theirs in return. And with that, I want to, in closing, I want to just express my thanks to Senator Cornyn and to his staff. And I want to express my thanks to the majority staff for working together in an almost seamless way and trying to bring us all together for what I think has been an informative hearing on the entry of merchandise into our U.S. ports. We thank you as well for joining us today. and for discussing the importance of trade enforcement and trade facilitation at the U.S. ports across our country. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, we call those QFRs, questions for the record. Those questions are due from our members in 7 days, a week from today. And we're going to ask our witnesses to respond to those in 24 hours. Just kidding. We're going to ask you to respond in 45 days. That's a long time. 45 days to respond to the questions for the record that you might receive from all of us. And one of my favorite parts of hearings, I chair the Committee on Environment and Public Works. We help write the bipartisan infrastructure bill. We're about to report out a major water resources development act bill legislature tomorrow. We'll record all kinds of issues, recycling, you name it. We get into all kinds of stuff. And occasionally at the end of those hearings, I will want to make a unanimous consent request. And you ask unanimous consent that you want to get something done or into the record. And if there's none of my colleagues are still in the room, if they've left and gone to other hearings and they're on the floor voting or stuff, I love asking unanimous consent to do stuff when nobody's in the room because there's nobody there to object. So if there's no objection, we're going to adjourn. And as you leave, go with our thanks and hope you give us a chance to follow up with you and explore some of what's been discussed today. Thank you very much. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.